Millbrook, Michigan, a small farming community surrounded by cornfields and frozen forests, where everyone knew each other by name and the routine rarely changed. With just 847 residents, the silence of winter nights was broken only by the distant sound of tractors or the wind cutting through snow-covered roads. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and neighbors looked out for one another. Until one February night in 2003 would change everything. That February 14th, Valentine's Day, arrived accompanied by one of the worst snowstorms of the decade. The roads were nearly impassable, houses covered in thick layers of ice, and the town seemed asleep under the weight of winter. Among these homes was that of Sarah Chen, a 23-year-old nursing student known for her dedication and kindness. The only child of Linda Chen, a factory worker who lived in Lansing, Sarah dreamed of graduating and working at the local hospital, helping the community that had seen her grow up. That night, she was sharing a home with her boyfriend, Derek Martinez, an automotive technician from Grand Rapids. The couple had a seemingly stable relationship, albeit one strained by debt and the grueling routine of school and work. A few minutes before 10 p.m., Sarah left home for a simple reason: to return a mug to her elderly neighbor, Elena Vance, who lived next door. An everyday, banal gesture. It would be Sarah's last memory alive. Elena, a widow for many years, watched the young woman cross the snow-covered yard, her red coat a stark contrast against the intense white of the storm. Inside, by the fireplace, sat her nephew, Robert Bob Vance, a reserved and helpful man who often helped her with household chores. No one could have imagined, at that moment, the role he would play in the tragedy that was about to mark Millbrook forever. And as the snow fell, covering footprints and erasing trails, the fate of the small town was silently sealed. Want to find out what happened that night Millbrook lost its peace? Then subscribe to the channel and stay tuned. The story is just beginning, and what comes next is even more surprising. On the night of February 14th, 2003, Millbrook, Michigan, was completely blanketed by one of the biggest snowstorms of the decade. The wind blew like an ancient voice that seemed to carry through the empty streets, and the houses, with their yellow lights, formed small islands of warmth amidst the endless white. It was Valentine's Day, and most residents had retired early, avoiding the bitter cold that battered Gratiot County. Inside a modest, single-story home, Sarah Chen was preparing to call it a day. A 23-year-old dedicated nursing student, she spent the evening reviewing her anatomy notes and sipping a hot cup of coffee while waiting for her boyfriend, Derek Martinez, to finish a computer game in the next room. It was an ordinary evening until she decided to cross the yard to return to her neighbor Elena Vance a simple mug she had borrowed hours earlier. At 9:47 p.m., the elderly woman watched through the window as the young woman wrapped in her red coat, contrasting with the white of the blizzard. Sarah walked carefully, coffee steam rising from her mug as the wind pulled her coat tighter around her. It was the last anyone saw of her. In less than an hour, she would disappear completely, leaving behind one of the most intriguing scenes in Michigan criminal history. When Derek realized Sarah hadn't returned, he figured she'd lingered, talking to her neighbor. The storm was intensifying, and the clock was ticking. At 10:30 p.m., restless, he put on his coat and crossed the yard, through the snow that was already covering his legs. He knocked on Mrs. Vance's door, and she greeted him with surprise. She confirmed that Sarah had left almost an hour ago. No noise, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Derek ran back home, calling his girlfriend's name, opening doors and drawers, looking under the bed, in the basement, and even in the small attic where they stored Christmas decorations. Nothing. The house was locked from the inside. The front deadbolt was on. The back door chain was still attached, and the windows were sealed with the insulating plastic Derek had installed weeks before to keep out the cold. Sarah's cell phone was charging in the bedroom. The mug she'd brought wasn't with her. It had probably been left at the neighbor's house. The soup on the counter was still steaming. The anatomy textbook was open on the table, and a yellow bookmark rested on the pages as if dropped mid-read. The digital clock above the microwave read 10:41 p.m. when Derek called the police, his voice trembling and his breath ragged. saying his girlfriend was missing. The first officers to arrive, led by veteran Deputy Wallace, were baffled by what they found. There were no signs of a struggle, no entry, no violence of any kind. The inside of the house was spotless, tidy, and warm. Outside, only Sarah and Derek's footprints marked the snow-covered yard, but it was by observing the tracks on the white ground that the mystery solidified. The young woman's footprints clearly led from Mrs. Vance's house to about 15 feet from the front door, and then they simply stopped. There was no sign of her turning back, slipping, or being covered by the blizzard. It was as if she had been lifted off the ground and carried away by the wind. The agents photographed the scene, measured the spacing between her footsteps, and analyzed the depth of the marks. Everything indicated she was walking normally, without running or showing any signs of fear. The last print showed a slight twist in her right foot, the result of an old teenage injury, proof that they were, in fact, Sarah's footprints. But beyond them, nothing. No other human marks, no vehicle tracks, no trace of a struggle, just emptiness. Inside the house, the wall clock continued to tick as if nothing had happened. The lamp in the corner still illuminated the open pages of a nursing textbook, and the scent of vanilla candles mingled with the aroma of cold soup. It was a frozen snapshot of a life interrupted by a simple gesture, returning a mug to a neighbor. As the clock struck midnight, the blizzard began to ease, but a sense of something supernatural hung over everyone who had set foot in that house. Sarah Chen's disappearance was not just a whodunit. It was an enigma that defied logic, physics, and human understanding. And for the residents of Millbrook, that would be the night the town's tranquility disappeared along with her. In the days following Sarah Chen's disappearance, Gratiot County was gripped by a mixture of curiosity, fear, and disbelief. News traveled quickly through the few streets of Millbrook. A young woman had disappeared from a locked house during a blizzard, leaving no sign of escape or resistance. For many, it was an impossible case. For others, there was a simpler and more human explanation. It was in this scenario that Detective Ray Morrison took charge of the investigation. A veteran of nearly 30 years, Morrison had left the hustle and bustle of Detroit in search of a peaceful retirement in the countryside. Millbrook, he thought, would be a place of petty crime, occasional theft, and neighborly disputes, but Sarah's disappearance would soon become the greatest challenge of his professional life. From the beginning, Morrison treated Sarah's boyfriend, Derek Martinez, as the main focus of his attention. It was standard procedure. Statistics showed that in cases involving young women who disappeared, the partner often knew more than they admitted. Derek, however, seemed genuinely stunned. He spent the first few hours after her disappearance pacing the house, answering the police officers' questions with sobs and rambling sentences. Still, Morrison didn't trust his emotions. He questioned him repeatedly, trying to find contradictions in his account. In total, there were 17 interviews over the course of months, each revisiting the same details. The time Sarah left, the time he waited, the moment he realized something was wrong. Derek repeated his answers with almost obsessive precision, never stumbling over dates or words. The evidence was uncooperative. There were no unknown fingerprints, no tire tracks, or strange footprints. The forensic report confirmed that the doors were locked from the inside, the windows were sealed, and there was no trace of a struggle. Morrison tried to fit the facts into a logical narrative, but each attempt ended in frustration. Deep down, he didn't believe in impossible disappearances, only in human error that had yet to be discovered. While the detective was drowning in reports, Linda Chen, Sarah's mother, began her own search. An assembly line worker at a Lansing factory, she quit her job to dedicate herself full-time to finding her daughter. She turned the small house Sarah and Derek rented into a makeshift headquarters. She spread maps across the living room table, marking areas where she believed Sarah might have been taken. She printed flyers with her daughter's face on them and pasted them on every streetlight, bakery, and gas station in the area. She called the sheriff's office, radio shows, and even television stations daily. For Linda, there was no rest until there were answers. Morrison, though impressed by her determination, began to see her as an obstacle. Linda persisted in improbable theories, questioned witnesses, and pressured officers for results. Their relationship became strained, marked by hard stares and short conversations. Meanwhile, the Millbrook community grew divided. Some residents offered support, participated in the search, and brought Linda food. Others whispered on street corners that Derek's story didn't make sense, that perhaps Sarah had run away on her own, tired of the simple life and her mother's pressure. In a small town, silence can be as cruel as violence. Time, however, eroded the initial momentum. Patrols dwindled, volunteers stopped showing up, and the following winter's snow again covered the fields where teams had searched for remains. Each new lead ended in frustration. Alleged sightings in other cities, anonymous calls, unfounded rumors. Sarah Chen's case, which had initially grabbed local headlines, was gradually pushed into bureaucratic oblivion. In February 2004, a year after the disappearance, Detective Morrison wrote the final report. The cold and concise document stated that all lines of investigation had been explored without result. There was no evidence, suspects, or new leads to justify additional resources. The case was filed under the classification cold case. The term, common among experienced police officers, meant more than a closed file. It represented the official end of a search. For Morrison, it was the failure that would mark her career. For Linda Chen, it was just the beginning of a silent promise to never let her daughter's name be forgotten. As the town tried to move on, she kept returning to that house, lighting candles in the window and gazing at the yard where Sarah's footprints had ended. In a mother's mind, no case is ever truly closed. As the months passed, the lack of answers began to weigh on Millbrook like a silent shadow. The small town, accustomed to the predictable routine of harvests, Sunday services, and gatherings at the local cafe, became a place of murmurs and suspicious glances. Everyone knew Sarah Chen, at least by sight, and the mystery of her disappearance became the main topic of conversation at the breakfast table, in grocery lines, and at church meetings. Stories mingled with the popular imagination, creating their own versions of events. Some said Sarah had run away to start a new life in Chicago, tired of the monotony of the countryside. Others whispered that Derek knew more than he was letting on. Some even hinted at something supernatural, as if the blizzard that night had swallowed the young woman and wiped her traces from the face of the earth. With each new rumor, Detective Ray Morrison saw the credibility of the investigation deteriorate. The case he had promised to solve began to disintegrate due to a lack of evidence. Piles of reports and testimonies piled up on his desk, but nothing made sense. He revisited photographs of the scene, maps, and call transcripts, searching for any detail he might have missed. Yet the more he looked, the more logic dissolved. Sarah seemed to have vanished, not just from a physical location, but from the entire rational structure of reality. For a man driven by facts and evidence, this absolute absence was unbearable. As Morrison grappled with the weight of her failure, the city continued to fuel the mystery with increasingly unlikely stories. Throughout 2003 and 2004, dozens of reports of alleged Sarah sightings emerged. In Bay City, a gas station attendant swore he saw a young woman who looked like her filling up a car in the middle of the night. In Flint, a waitress reported serving an Asian customer who seemed nervous and avoided conversation. In Traverse City, a hotel manager claimed to have hosted a woman fitting Sarah's description, but the security camera had failed that very night. Each new report rekindled a brief hope, followed by a deeper disappointment. None of them stood up to verification. For Morrison, these false leads were more than an obstacle. They were a constant reminder that the case was slipping out of his control. He began to isolate himself, avoiding talking to reporters and reducing meetings with the Chen family. The veteran detective, who had dreamed of a peaceful retirement, began sleeping in his office, rereading reports and deposition tapes, trying to find an invisible pattern. Over time, frustration turned to exhaustion. The glow of determination that had driven him in the early months slowly faded, replaced by a bitter sense of helplessness. As the police system weakened, Linda Chen became the true heart of the search. Widowed and now unemployed, She devoted every waking hour to her missing daughter. The living room of her small Lansing apartment became a makeshift hub, walls covered with maps, newspaper clippings, bus schedules, and notes connected possible routes and clues, forming a web of red lines that only she seemed to understand. She slept little, ate even less. Her phone was on 24/7, and any call from an unknown number made her heart race. The residents of Millbrook began to see Linda as a tragic figure. Some offered assistance, bringing food or helping to distribute flyers. Others, less patient, avoided passing her on the streets, tired of reopening old wounds. She, however, didn't care what anyone thought. For Linda, as long as there was no body, Sarah was still alive somewhere. It was a belief others called denial, but for her, it was the only thread holding her together. In the police files, the Chen case gradually sank to the back of the file cabinet. Morrison, exhausted, resigned. Sarah's disappearance had become an invisible weight, a reminder that even the most seasoned professionals are powerless in the face of the inexplicable. The snow melted. The seasons passed, but in Millbrook, nothing was the same again. Sarah's name continued to be whispered with reverence and fear, like a story no one fully understood, but which everyone felt was not yet over. When Detective Jimmy Sullivan arrived in Gratiot County in September 2005, the Sarah Chen case was already a local legend. The disappearance of a young woman from a locked house during a blizzard, with no trace or witnesses, was the kind of story whispered in bars and repeated with awe in schools. The case file remained stored on dusty shelves in the sheriff's department basement, among boxes of old burglary reports and rural accident records. Sullivan had moved to the area seeking peace after 15 years with the Michigan State Police. He was tired of dealing with brutal homicides and senseless crimes. He sought a slower pace, smaller investigations, something that would keep him occupied without devouring him. But the tranquility he hoped to find would be replaced by a new form of torment. Early in his life, while familiarizing himself with local cases, Sullivan came across the Chen file. The initial report, the crime photos, Morrison's notes, everything was strikingly absurd. He spent an entire afternoon poring over the documents, and before he knew it, the shift was over and the building was empty. The description of the broken footprints in the snow, the complete absence of signs of violence, and the domestic normality of the scene intrigued him deeply. It was as if logic had been stripped from the case, an impossible disappearance that defied the reasoning of any investigator. The detective began reviewing every detail. He requested copies of the original statements, reopened the photographic reports, and cross-referenced times and distances. Soon, Sarah Chen's case went from curiosity to obsession. He visited the former crime scene, now occupied by new tenants, and walked through the grassy backyard, wondering where the footprints might have ended. He attempted to replicate the path described in the reports, studied wind patterns, and even consulted meteorologists to understand the behavior of the 2003 blizzard. What began as a routine review turned into something personal. As the private investigation intensified, Sullivan began to withdraw from his colleagues. He spent entire nights reviewing the case in his small office or at home, where he dedicated an entire room to what he called the Chen room. There, he pasted photographs, reports, and maps on the walls. He used colored string to connect evidence and schedules, creating a web of connections that only he seemed to understand. He slept little, ate poorly, and gradually began to lose control of the boundaries between his personal life and work. The department began to notice his declining performance on other cases. He would forget appointments, delay reports, and sometimes become irritated by trivial questions. The concerned sheriff tried to temporarily remove him, but Sullivan refused. The Chen case had become more than a mystery. It was a wound in his mind. He believed that somehow the truth was still there, hidden in some detail overlooked by police in 2003. He was a man pursued not by a criminal, but by an enigma. Between 2007 and 2015, Sullivan revisited the file at least once a month. He re-interviewed witnesses, now older and weary. Mrs. Mukherjee Vance, the elderly neighbor, barely remembered what she had said years before. But her nephew, Robert Vance, appeared several times in old reports. Though seemingly irrelevant, Sullivan recorded the name, but there was nothing to link him to the disappearance. The detective became increasingly meticulous and isolated. Some colleagues called him the footprint man, a bitter joke about his fixation on the case no one else believed he could solve. The years passed, and Sullivan grew old with the mystery. His hair grayed, his vision grew weary, but the idea that something was missing from the investigation never left him. Until in 2019, a call changed everything. The contact came from the Michigan State Laboratory. A new DNA extraction technology was being applied to cold cases, and the material collected from Sarah Chen's coat, fibers archived since 2003, had yielded a partial result. It was a male profile, a genetic presence that should never have been there. Sullivan felt his heart race. For nearly 14 years, he had waited for any sign that Sarah hadn't disappeared by accident, that someone, somewhere, knew what really happened that night. The discovery wasn't just scientific. It was a fissure in the silence that had enveloped Millbrook for so long. For the first time in decades, there was a new trail to follow. And for Detective Jimmy Sullivan, who had dedicated half his life to this mystery, that DNA fragment was the wake-up call he'd been waiting for since the day he opened the first file bearing Sarah Chen's name. In March 2019, 16 years after Sarah Chen's disappearance, the case that had become synonymous with police frustration unexpectedly revived. It all began in a somewhat bureaucratic fashion, when the Michigan State Laboratory initiated a program to reanalyze archived evidence from old investigations. Advances in DNA extraction techniques now allowed genetic profiles to be identified from tiny amounts of biological material, something impossible in 2003. Among the dozens of samples sent to the laboratory were small fibers collected from Sarah's red coat, found hanging in her bedroom the morning after her disappearance. The fabric had been carefully stored as part of the evidence, although at the time, it had revealed nothing relevant. The lead analyst, Dr. Angela Martinez, would later recall that the case intrigued her as soon as she read the original report. A coat hung, intact, inside the locked house. The last item of clothing the young woman had worn that night, removed calmly, with no sign of violence. Under the lenses and reagents of the new technology, the fibers began to reveal a secret kept for nearly 2 decades. In one of the samples, the doctor found traces of male DNA, enough fragments to assemble a partial genetic profile composed of 13 unique markers. It wasn't enough for immediate identification, but enough to open a new line of research. Furthermore, the analysis detected an unusual chemical residue stuck to the fibers, a type of industrial soap used in institutional settings such as hospitals, schools, and government buildings. This discovery further intrigued the technicians. The compound, a mixture of disinfectant and professional detergent, was not sold for domestic use. This indicated that the man whose DNA was present on Sarah's coat likely worked in or frequented places that required high standards of hygiene and sterilization. For the first time in years, the case gained concrete direction. When the report reached Detective Jimmy Sullivan, he read every line with bated breath. He jotted down details, made calculations, and cross-referenced dates. The DNA was the evidence he had waited nearly 15 years for, a tangible fragment that linked the victim to someone else. Sullivan wasted no time. He requested a comparison of the partial genetic profile with the state's criminal database, and, in parallel, launched his own parallel investigation. If the soap was used in hospital settings, it made sense to start there. Sarah was a nursing student, and part of her internships had been spent in local clinics and hospitals. The detective compiled a list of all the staff, my patients, and service providers who had had contact with her in the months before her disappearance. For weeks, Sullivan cross-referenced information between work records, hospital shifts, and home addresses. The process was slow and exhausting, but every detail reinforced the feeling that the culprit had always been closer than anyone imagined. In a cross-reference between the original interviewees, files from 2003, and the names linked to the use of industrial soap, a name emerged he hadn't expected to see. Robert Bob Vance, the nephew of elderly neighbor Elena Vance, who had been one of the last people to see Sarah alive. In the original investigation, Bob had been a mere footnote, a helpful man who cared for his aunt and, according to testimony, was present at her home the night she disappeared. His name had never appeared among the suspects, and his interview, conducted by Morrison years earlier, had been brief. However, when Sullivan looked up the man's employment history, he discovered he worked as a maintenance supervisor at Gratiot County Medical Center, just a few miles away. The hospital used precisely the type of chemical found in the coat's fibers. Sullivan felt his stomach churn. The pattern he had sought for so many years was beginning to emerge clearly. Bob Vance had access to industrial cleaning products, moved in areas difficult to trace, and was in the neighborhood the night Sarah disappeared. Furthermore, he knew the young woman's schedule and Kaoli, through his closeness to her aunt, had information about Sarah's habits. He was invisible, integrated into the community's routine, with no criminal record and no apparent reason to arouse suspicion. The detective knew that a partial genetic profile wasn't enough evidence to bring charges. But for the first time, the line between the impossible and the plausible seemed to blur. The evidence pointed to a man everyone knew and trusted. DNA had opened a crack in the darkness that had shrouded the case for so many years. And through that crack, Sullivan was about to see the face of a killer who lived in plain sight. When Robert Ababa Vance's name emerged from the data mining, Detective Jimmy Sullivan instinctively knew he was looking at the missing piece. For years, he had viewed Sarah Chen's case as an unsolvable enigma, a cruel trick of reality that defied all logic. Now, the impossible was beginning to take on human form. Vance, then 68, was known in Millbrook as a reserved and helpful man, the kind of neighbor who mowed other people's lawns during the summer and helped mend fences before storms. She was trusted by the community, attended the local church, and had cared for her elderly aunt, Elena Vance, since her uncle's death. To any superficial eye, she was a model of a quiet citizen. But behind this facade of kindness lay something darker, something that science had just revealed. Sullivan delved into the records of Gratiot County Medical Center, where Bob had worked for over 2 decades as a maintenance supervisor. His position granted him unrestricted access to virtually every area of the hospital: corridors, storage rooms, laundry rooms, and laboratories. He was familiar with the security systems, had master keys, and had free access at night. He also had access to institutional pickup trucks used for emergency services, vehicles that were rarely closely monitored. This combination of access, anonymity, and mobility gave him the power to act without arousing suspicion. In colleagues' testimonies, consistent descriptions emerged. Bob was meticulous, almost obsessive about cleanliness, and spent long periods alone in technical areas of the building. But as Sullivan delved deeper into the interviews, uncomfortable stories began to emerge. Young nurses, interns, and cleaning staff recalled comments and actions by Bob that, at the time, had been interpreted as merely awkward attempts at friendliness. He asked personal questions, observed check-in and check-out times, and sometimes appeared in places he shouldn't have been, offering to help carry boxes or change light bulbs. No one had formally reported the behavior, but the memory of his persistent gaze left a trail of discomfort. Reviewing the 2003 files, Sullivan realized that Bob had been present at nearly every point surrounding Sarah's disappearance. On the night of the crime, he was at his aunt's house, just a few feet from the yard where Sarah had passed before disappearing. Elena Vance had mentioned in her testimony that her nephew had spent the afternoon helping prepare the house for the cold, bringing in firewood and checking the heating system. When Sarah arrived to return the mug, Bob was there. This coincidence, which had previously seemed trivial, now seemed crucial. With access to his aunt's spare key, Bob could easily enter and leave neighboring houses without arousing suspicion. Sullivan reconstructed the scenario in his mind. Sarah crosses the yard. Bob watches through the window, perhaps following her under the pretense of helping her weather the blizzard. Inside the young woman's house, the situation spirals out of control. DNA evidence found on the coat's fibers indicated direct contact, a touch prolonged enough to transfer genetic material. It wasn't a mere casual trace. It was an undeniable physical presence. When the lab confirmed that the partial genetic profile obtained from the fibers matched Bob Vance's, the line between hypothesis and fact blurred. Sullivan received official confirmation in April 2019. 13 genetic markers perfectly matched Vance's profile. The lab report left no room for doubt. The same man who had helped search for Sarah, who had comforted the victim's mother, and who had participated in the church's community outreach efforts, had left his DNA on the missing girl's clothing. The detective stared at the paper for a long time, silent. After so many years of searching, the answer was there, cold and objective, written in codes and percentages. Bob Vance's previously impeccable record was beginning to reveal itself as a smokescreen. Sullivan discovered that he had already been quietly transferred from 2 hospital departments after informal complaints of inappropriate behavior. There had never been a legal process, only internal recommendations. The same skill that made him a reliable employee had helped him hide a disturbing nature. He was an invisible man, living in plain sight. As the detective reviewed old statements and connected new evidence, Bob's image became increasingly disturbing. The helpful neighbor, the exemplary worker, and the caring nephew who visited his aunt every day were, in fact, the hidden link in Sarah Chen's disappearance. DNA was the silent testimony that no alibi could erase. For Sullivan, this was more than a forensic discovery. It was the culmination of an obsession that had consumed 14 years of his life, and the beginning of a new and inevitable stage of the investigation. In April 2019, shortly after receiving the report confirming Robert Bob Vance's DNA in the fibers of Sarah Chen's coat, Detective Jimmy Sullivan knew he couldn't rush. One mistake could ruin everything. Genetic evidence was powerful, but on its own, it still needed legal and psychological support. If Bob realized he was being investigated, he would have time to destroy evidence, flee, or even take his own life. So Sullivan opted for a slower, more calculated approach. He began discreet surveillance, observing every move of the man who, for 16 years, had lived among the residents of Millbrook as a model citizen. From an unmarked car, the detective spent weeks monitoring Bob's routine. He would leave home at 6 in the morning, drive the hospital truck, work a full shift, and return around 3:30 in the afternoon. At night, the living room curtains would be left half open, revealing a solitary figure watching television at a low volume. Seemingly unremarkable, Sullivan noticed subtle changes. Bob seemed restless, his movements nervous, and he began drinking excessively. Beer cans and whiskey bottles piled up in the trash can, something neighbors claimed they had never seen before. There was a profound weariness about him, a heaviness that seemed to grow with each passing day. The most revealing behavior, however, was different. Bob began visiting the grave of his aunt, who had died 2 years earlier, with increasing frequency. Previously, the visits had been monthly. Now, they were daily. Sullivan watched him from afar. From inside the car parked next to the cemetery gate, the man knelt before the headstone, murmuring inaudible words, sometimes covering his face with his hands. It was as if he were conversing with a ghost. This, for the detective, was a clear sign. Bob's conscience was crumbling under the weight of the truth. The first direct contact took place on April 15th. Sullivan called him in for a routine conversation, under the pretense of reviewing old statements in the context of the new cold case review. Bob accepted without resistance. Sitting in the hospital conference room, visibly tense, his voice trembled, sweat dripping down his forehead. The detective limited himself to neutral questions, letting the silence do the psychological work. Bob answered vaguely, but there was something betraying fear in his eyes. When the meeting ended, he left quickly, avoiding eye contact. 3 days later, Sullivan scheduled the second interview. This time, he mentioned advances in forensic science and new DNA methods. Upon hearing this, Bob paled. He asked for a glass of water and remained silent for several seconds before resuming the conversation, his voice hoarse and barely audible. He said he knew nothing, that it was a mistake, but his rapid breathing and trembling hands betrayed the serenity he was trying to convey. At the end of the meeting, he asked to end the conversation and staggered out, heading for the bathroom. Sullivan discreetly followed him and heard him vomit behind the door. The third interview, conducted on April 22nd, was the breaking point. The detective entered the room with the lab report in hand, but didn't show it right away. He simply looked Bob in the eye and calmly said, "We know." The man didn't ask, "What?" He stood still, his shoulders slumped, as if something inside him had broken. After a few minutes of absolute silence, he murmured, "I never meant for it to happen that way." The confession was fragmented. Amidst sobs and long pauses, Bob admitted to following Sarah that night, under the pretense of helping her cross the yard in the blizzard. He said that, inside the house, he tried to approach her inappropriately and was rejected. She reacted, pushing him, and in the confusion, hit her head on the kitchen counter. He claimed the impact was accidental, but that panic drove him to irreversible action. He remained with the body for hours, unable to decide what to do, until he decided to conceal the crime and fake an impossible disappearance. With access to his aunt's house key and familiarity with basic scene isolation techniques, Bob cleaned everything, locked the doors from the inside, exited through the basement, and manipulated the surrounding snow to erase any tracks, preserving only Sarah's footprints. The goal was to create an inexplicable story that would divert any suspicion. The plan worked for over a decade. When Sullivan asked where the body was, Bob fell silent. His teary eyes drifted into space, and he responded with a sentence the detective would record verbatim in the report. "She rests where the water is still, and the old oak watches." No other details were provided. Bob seemed relieved to finally have spoken, but also lost, as if confessing was just the prelude to a guilt that would never leave him. Sullivan ended the interview and left the room, certain that, after 16 years, the truth was beginning to emerge. But the weight of that confession still left more questions than answers, especially about the mysterious place where Sarah Chen had allegedly been left forever. News of Robert Bob Vance's arrest spread through Millbrook within hours, shattering the silence of a town that had learned to live with mystery as part of its landscape. On the morning of April 24th, 2019, county patrol cars surrounded Vance's modest home on Maple Street, while curious onlookers gathered on the dew-covered corners. The man who for years had helped repair roofs, carry groceries for the elderly, and light candles at church services was now escorted handcuffed down the sidewalk, his face drawn and his eyes downcast. Local cameras captured the moment he was placed in the police car, and the footage, broadcast on state television, provoked a wave of disbelief. The helpful and kind neighbor was, after all, the killer the town had been searching for 16 years. In cafes and grocery stores, the conversation was one of a kind. People tried to understand how someone so ordinary had deceived everyone for so long. Many remembered him participating in the search in the days following Sarah's disappearance, walking alongside volunteers and offering comfort to those who mourned. "He held my hand when we thought we had found a clue," said a former colleague of Sarah's in an interview with a local radio station. "I never imagined that same man could be the culprit." The general feeling was one of betrayal. Millbrook, which prided itself on being a close-knit community, was discovering that evil could hide precisely under the guise of kindness. For Derek Martinez, the arrest meant the end of a nightmare that had lasted nearly half his life. For 16 years, he had been eyed with suspicion, whispered about on street corners, and avoided at city events. Many believed he was truly responsible for his girlfriend's disappearance, that his calmness during interrogations was a sign of coldness and guilt. When news of Bob's confession arrived, Derek was in Grand Rapids, working at an auto repair shop. He received a call from his sister and remained silent for a long time before answering. Relief, anger, and sadness mingled in his voice. I said I didn't do anything," he later remarked, "but no one wanted to believe me." Despite the moral freedom the discovery brought him, the scars of suspicion would remain. He had lost friendships, jobs, and part of his youth to a crime he didn't commit. Linda Chen learned of the arrest by phone. Detective Sullivan called personally, shortly before dawn. His voice was firm, but there was a tone of respect and compassion in his words. Hearing Bob Vance's name, Linda remained speechless. For a moment, she thought it was a mistake. some kind of misunderstanding. But when the detective explained about the DNA and the confession, she let the phone slip from her hands. She cried soundlessly, her body hunched over the table, as if the news were too heavy to hold inside her. There was relief. At last, the truth she had sought for so many years was finally coming to light. But there was also profound devastation. Her daughter's killer was not a stranger, but a man who had lived just steps away, who had had coffee in her kitchen and offered help in her darkest days. It was a pain that mixed justice and disbelief, closure and emptiness. Even with the confession, the absence of Sarah's body prevented complete closure of the case. The search intensified after Bob's enigmatic statements, where the water is still and the old oak tree watches. But the enigma seemed like a final gesture of control, a way to keep the town prisoner to its mystery. Ground radar teams and divers searched lakes and abandoned properties, to no avail. Sarah's body remained missing, and with it, the possibility of a true rest for her mother. Detective Sullivan, for his part, reached the truth, but found no peace. The case that had consumed 14 years of his life ended without the relief he had hoped for. He felt torn between duty fulfilled and the melancholy of someone who had dedicated everything to an answer that arrived too late. Seeing Bob Vance escorted down the courthouse corridor, Sullivan felt no triumph, only a profound weariness, an emptiness that seemed to echo that of the town itself. Millbrook, at last, had a culprit, but the feeling was that everyone had lost something in the process. Trust, innocence, and the very belief that evil could be identified before it touched so close. The truth had been revealed, but the chill of February 2003 still hung over the place, reminding everyone that some wounds, even with justice, never completely heal. Sarah Chen's story is more than a police report about a disappearance and an arrest. It's a mirror that reflects human illusions, fears, and contradictions. Millbrook, with its quiet streets, helpful neighbors, and naive belief in the safety of the countryside, believed itself protected from tragedy. The town embodied the idea that evil always belongs to the other, to the unknown, to the outsider. But Sarah's case proved otherwise. The danger was there all along, disguised in routine, in the familiar face offering help, and in the kind words spoken by those who, secretly, harbored dark intentions. The disappearance of a young woman and the belated discovery of her killer shattered not only the community's trust, but also its very notion of innocence. Among all the layers of this story, the most powerful driving force was obstinacy. Linda Chen and Detective Jimmy Sullivan are two characters shaped by pain and guilt. For Linda, the loss of her daughter became a purpose, to find answers when the whole world seemed to give up. She became the symbol of a motherhood that refuses to resign itself, that resists the coldness of time and bureaucracy. Sullivan, tormented by his failure to solve the case in the past, dedicated his life to pursuing a truth that seemed unattainable. Both walked driven by different feelings, love and guilt, but united by the same need to make sense of the inexplicable. In the end, it was this obstinacy that overcame oblivion and made the truth emerge from the shadows. Time is also an essential character in this narrative. It took 16 years of silence before technology became capable of revealing what human eyes could not perceive. The fibers of the redcoat, forgotten in an archive, held within them the silent testimony of a crime that waited patiently to be revealed. Scientific advancement not only unraveled a mystery, it showed that the past, no matter how distant it may seem, is never completely buried. The truth may take time, but it finds a way, even if it must wait for science to evolve. And at the center of it all stands the most disturbing figure, Robert Bob Vance, the man who symbolizes evil disguised as kindness. He was the solicitous neighbor, the exemplary employee, the caring nephew who visited his elderly aunt. He participated in the search for Sarah, offered comfort to the victim's mother, and lived peacefully among those who trusted him most. Bob was not the monster lurking in the shadows. He was the common face of everyday evil, the one masquerading as virtue. His discovery destroyed more than lives. It shattered the belief that danger can be recognized by a mere glance. He is the portrait of the banality of evil. The idea that cruelty can quietly inhabit everyday life, smiling among neighbors. In the end, Millbrook was never the same. The town that prided itself on its peace had to accept that evil doesn't come from outside. It grows silently within. Derek was exonerated. Linda received the truth she'd sought all her life. And Detective Sullivan, though he found the culprit, never found peace. Each of them paid a high price for the answer they so desperately desired. Justice was finally achieved, but it brought no solace. Sarah's body remained missing, as if time refused to fully surrender what it had taken. Sarah Chen's story ends where many stories begin, with the awakening of a community that believed itself invulnerable. It's a reminder that the truth may take time, but it always comes out, and when it does, it rarely brings comfort. It reveals, exposes, and transforms. Millbrook learned this too late, but its lesson remains. If you've made it this far, you know this story goes far beyond a solved crime. It's about love, obsession, and the relentless power of truth. So, subscribe to the channel and continue following our real and impactful stories. There are many stories like Sarah Chen's, and each one carries a truth that time has yet to tell.